I am going to do a kind of recap at the very end, because this is a long, complicated story, and there are storylines over here and storylines over there, and I want to tie them all back together. But so far, we're still focusing on the interwar period, and we've seen two directions. We spent some time on the constructivist point of view, the utopian idealist who thought it was the birth of a new age and certain kind of forms, like geometric abstraction. This was the language of that new world. Then we saw a different path that was followed by the surrealists, who also believed that there was going to be a new age, but they were going to create it, and they were going to do so by rejecting rationalism in favor of a more sort of psychologically driven way of looking at the world, rooting into the subconscious mind for ideas of creativity, and relying more on intuition and instinct rather than rational. So those were, so far, the two main, and they still really are, the two main directions of modernism in the interwar period. And they're movements of the 1920s, but both continue into the 30s as well, although they're born in the 20s. But the 30s saw more than that, because a lot of things changed in the cultural context of Europe and America in 1929, 1930. This is when everything goes to hell, right? You have the Great Depression in 29, the great disillusionment with communism. The 20s was all this socialists, and everybody was a socialist, intellectuals and artists, because communism was the great savior. But it was evident by 29 that this wasn't working, that Hitler is out there signing pacts with Stalin, and it's just not what they thought it was. So it's a great disillusionment. Totalitarian leaders are coming into power in Europe, everywhere. Things are looking pretty darn bleak, and economically as well as politically and socially. And so we have a backlash. We have a conservative strain that is the other side of the optimism of the 20s. So you got the pendulum swung way over here in the 20s, and now it's going to crash back in the 30s. At the same time, however, these other things are still going on. So it's complicated. We're going to focus on this vein. Conservatism. We're going to look first at what's happening in America early, before World War I. Look at some of these early American schools of modernism, although they don't know or understand European modernism yet. So we'll look at the Ashcan school, and then we'll talk about Alfred Stieglitz and his gallery in New York, and how his role is so important in introducing modernism to America. And then the Armory Show of 1913, forgot to put the date down, but that is what really opens the door and introduces European modernism to America. It has a huge impact, not just in terms of the art that they see, as we'll see. The 30s conservative backlash then, Great Depression. We're going to talk about in America the support for the arts, the WPA program, the Federal Arts Project, and all of the complicated government involvement in the arts in the 30s. And it's extremely complicated. Really studying this, you realize this government was unbelievable in terms of all of the commissions and committees, and they were changed. A lot of them were short-lived. Many of them were 4 years, and then it changes, and there's another one for another 4 years, and then another one for 3 years replaces that one, and it's just constant flux. The New Deal is fascinating. So we'll look at that and talk about how that affects the arts, because all this is still part of the conservative backlash. And then we'll go back to Europe and look at totalitarian art, because art does play a role in Nazi Germany and in Stalinist Russia, but it's very much a reaction against the kinds of modernism they'd seen before. And we'll talk about why that is. Why do both of these totalitarian governments favor the same kind of art? There is a reason for that, even though they saw themselves as two opposite poles. They're still rejecting something for the same reason. And then we'll come back and look at American art, not from the WPA, but nonetheless still expressing that same conservative American point of view, and that is American scene painting. So that's where we're going to go today. So a lot to take a look at. So let's talk about the Ashcan School. And the first thing I'm going to do is take these guys and move them out of our way so we can see. Okay, this is a photo from 1898 I found, identified as the Ashcan School, and I don't know who these people are, so I'm just taking somebody's word for it. If it's labeled wrong, this could be anybody, I don't know. I just like to show pictures of people, but there weren't this many artists in the Ashcan School, so it's more, they're probably in here somewhere. The Ashcan School is a name that was given to a group of artists centered around Robert Henry. Robert Henry was an artist of the late 19th and early 20th century from Philadelphia. In the 19th century, Philadelphia was the center of the American art world. In fact, the Philadelphia Academy of Art was as close to America had as an academy as you're going to find, sort of the equivalent of the French Academy and the Munich Academy. It was like the big art school in America where you wanted to go and find recognition. So Philadelphia was and still is a major art center. He became a mentor there to a group of young illustrators. And we're going to look at some of their work, William Glackens, George Lukes. These names are going to come up, so don't worry about it. Everett Shinn, John Sloan. And many of them worked on newspapers, and they were all illustrators. There's a strong illustrational vein to the Ashcan School. And defining illustration in art is not easy. It's a term that's kind of hard to describe. During much of the history of modernism, illustration was a term that was often a term of derision. You're just an illustrator, you're not an artist. There's seen as a difference. Illustration is a term used generally when someone is creating an image in order to expand on a narrative. Just think of a book illustration. An image in a book or an image in a newspaper is there not as a work of fine art where the artist is expressing themselves, but it's in there to illustrate some pre-existing text or narrative. And I'm going to add to that narrative or text by creating this image. So it has as much to do with the intent of the image as it does the style. It's not necessarily stylistically different from any other work of art. It's just that its purpose is different. And during the modernist period, where modernism is defined by your handling of the medium and your personal self-expression, illustration stands out as being something different from that. I think today of something like graphic design is a good example of illustration, because graphic designers are working from an assignment and they're creating images to illustrate some point or to make some point. They're not doing fine art. Nobody thinks that that's fine art, even though it may be really, it could stand on its own. Typically, illustrations aren't meant to stand on their own. And that's where they're coming from. And that's a big part of what we see in their work. Henry said, for one thing, he was speaking against the sort of modernist phrase, art for art's sake. And he said, no, he believed in art for life's sake. But that's not so different from art from society's sake, which we've seen before. Now, what are we doing? There we go. Here's an example. I think Everett Shinn is a good example of illustrational art. In this work, Fire on Mott Street, they're New York artists. They moved from Philadelphia fairly early to New York, and they're illustrating scenes of life in New York. They're really kind of telling a story. They're not realists. They're not interested in just going out and depicting what they see. They're interested in telling the story of New York, and particularly the vitality, sometimes the seamy side or the underbelly, or they just create works that are intensely evocative. I mean, if you lived there, you would feel these. They're the sorts of things you would see in a magazine or in a newspaper because of the way they illustrate that. They did show in galleries. They did show in the National Arts Club, galleries in New York. So they were fairly successful, and they had some independent exhibitions in 1910, and they were included in the Armory show, which I'll talk about later. They didn't see themselves as social critics necessarily, or as reformers. They weren't trying to change the world. They were just trying to show it to you. Very sort of middle-class images. I think the closest equivalent to what they're doing is what someone like Manet and Degas were doing. That second generation of realists in Paris who were going around and illustrating the life of the streets and the life of the city. And we see that very much in some of their work. So technically they're realists. They didn't use that term, but that's really what they are. They're realists. They're depicting what they see. And there's certainly a lot of drawing is a very important part of this. It is a painting, but it's very much like a colored drawing. This is another Shin. This is simply his style, which is probably the most illustrational of all of them. The Eviction. It's reminiscent of, say, 19th century realism. I think it's more reminiscent of 19th century than it is 20th. I mean, this isn't really up to date on 20th century modernism. It's closest to somebody like Courbet's Stonebreakers, showing the working class and the toil, closest to Manet's Life on the Streets, and Degas' indoor city life. That's really their context. In fact, here's a Shin, The Rehearsal, from 1905. It's hard to find anything that's not closer to Degas. He's clearly seen, he's clearly aware, and depicting the same scenes. And I love it because it's just, really ties them to their tradition. It's one reason why the Ashcan School doesn't get a lot of recognition. In fact, American art doesn't. Within the art history community, American studies is considered a weaker form, a sort of lower form. Like when I was in grad school, very few people specialized in American studies, and it was kind of looked down on, like, because it is weaker. And it tended to be the weaker students, actually, who specialized in American studies. It's because they're really very 19th century. They're not really up to date in what's going on in the 20th. But they're beautiful paintings. Some of these are phenomenal. Luke's, again, this is a very 19th century painting in many ways. In terms of the loose paint handling, it's reminiscent of Impressionist, post-Impressionist mostly, but there's not a real sense of light and brilliant color. But it's nonetheless a beautiful painting of Houston Street in New York. Bellows is really known for his fight paintings. He's very famous for these scenes of fights, prize fights, and this was very much street life in New York. Prize fighting was huge in early 20th century, continued to be so really up until 1950s or 60s or something. There were fights on, I remember growing up, there were fights on television like every week. There was Friday night fights. There were shown live on television. It was a big thing. I'm not quite sure when it sort of disappeared, but this is sort of his specialty. But my favorite of his is something like this. I love this. Cliff Dwellers. Now, to me, this is a beautiful merging of a 19th and a 20th century sensibility. It has a little of both. I mean, the title is wonderful. I love the way he's looking at the city and thinking about the city as this sort of primitive environment, as the people, as almost like a clan living in the cliffs. And yet, while the subject is very 19th century, the way he's depicting it in sort of a lot of fine detail and patterning and repetition of forms is very 20th century. I don't think this could actually pass as a 19th century painting. So there's something about it that's a little bit of both. And probably the most famous ashcan painting is John Sloan McSorley's Bar. This is very, very good example of illustration. This is something that at the time, everybody knew stories of McSorley's Bar. It was like one of those places. I'm trying to think of something that's comparable to that right now. Nothing's coming to mind, but some sort of place where everybody's heard of and knows the stories. And so he's sort of illustrating that or giving us a little example of what it would have looked like on one evening. This beautiful contrast. Again, there's a lot of Manet that I see in here as well stylistically. The name of the group, Ashcan School, came from a drawing by George Bellows called Disappointments of the Ash Can. And I could only find a very small reproduction of the drawing. Some works of art are carefully guarded. Copyrights, and you won't find them online. It's very rare, but I couldn't find anything large enough to expand. It's just a drawing. It's not a painting. It's a little drawing of illustration of a bunch of boys out in a back alley going through like a trash can, which they called ash cans at the time. And that got published, it got parodied in a cartoon in the New York Sun in 1916, and a critic wrote something about it, and it was referred to as ash can. It was meant to be derogatory again, but it kind of stuck because it suggested sort of the back streets of New York, the sort of seamy side of New York, but the reality of the city. And so they liked the name, and it is kind of important. Stylistically, they tend to be a dark palette, as you've seen in many of them. They tend to use fairly broad strokes. And the influence is primarily from illustration, newspaper, magazine illustration. So that's what's going on in New York before World War I. And there are some new aspects to it, but there's really no sign in there of 20th century European modernism. There's signs in it of 19th century European modernism, but not 20th. Not yet, because they don't know that much about it. There are a lot of Americans in Europe working, but they're not as yet coming back. They're not bringing those ideas back yet. But I want to talk briefly about Alfred Stieglitz, not as a photographer, which is what he was, but mostly about the gallery that he opened in New York. Alfred Stieglitz is very, very important in the history of art, important as a photographer in art. And he became very important by 1908. The gallery that he opened in New York in 1905 was known as the Little Galleries of the Photo Secession. Even before that, in 1902, he was the leader of a movement of photographers. They called themselves the Photo Secession. And they chose that word secession, you may remember when we were looking at 19th century, it was based on all those secession movements in Germany and Austria in the 1890s. Remember Klimt, and there was the Munich secession, the Berlin secession, the Vienna secession, where artists in the 1890s were creating little movements they called secession movements, and they were breaking away from the main artist organizations. So that idea was still in the air, secession movements. And he broke away from sort of traditional photography. And one of his main goals was to bring photography into the realm of fine art and to prove that it is a fine art. Photography has always struggled with acceptance as a fine art because people always just saw it as a technical act. You just point this camera, what's art about that? But we know now that that's not true. That's That's no more technical than painting is just a paintbrush, and you just move it around. I mean, you're making choices, you're doing all the things any other artist is doing, but he's sort of one of the first. And soon after that group was formed, the magazine Camera Works was created in 1903, and he was an editor on that. And then they opened the galleries. I'm showing you this photo because it's the most famous photograph. The steerage is probably the most famous American photograph today. The majority of people know about. Could everybody out there please mute your connection, because we're getting a lot of noise. Not sure where it's coming from. Okay, but I really don't want to talk about photography. I'm moving on. It was called the Little Galleries of the Photo Secession, because it was just a series of tiny little rooms, although we call it 291. Even then it was called 291 because it was located at 291 Fifth Avenue. So everybody just, it was a lot easier to say 291 than the Little Galleries of the Photo Secession. So 291 is what I'm going to call it, what everybody called it. It was a gathering place that, they just didn't have this in New York. What New York didn't have was an art center. It didn't have a place of focus where artists could come and meet and talk about things. It didn't have that. Americans, to a great extent, Americans really didn't learn how to form groups, art groups, until World War II or after World War II, because that's another thing that European artists taught Americans when they came over. But this is the beginning. It's a place. His chief partner or ally was Edward Steichen, who we're going to come back to, another important photographer at the time. And with his support, and Steichen went to Europe and lived there for a while, and he became the main sort of Paris branch of the office, as they called it. They began organizing and bringing in works from Europe to show here. And a wide range of shows that people could come and people could see for the first time. They discussed issues, they discussed theories. It was a place for free spirits and a pipeline to Paris, which was so important. The artists who sort of hung out there said that they had a real sort of sense of the moment. And I've heard artists describe other places like that, where you just feel like you're in the right place at the right time, and everything's happening right now, and there's an excitement to it. You can see they're not very big rooms. It was a place where a great many artists were first introduced to this company, to this country, from 1908 on. Rodin drawings were first shown there. Matisse showed there in April of that year, paintings, prints, drawings. Now, these artists didn't come over just their works of art. In fact, this was Matisse's first one-man show outside of France. Even before he started showing in Germany, he had works in a one-man show here at 291. Caused quite a stir, as you can imagine, very different from what Americans were doing. But they found it to be a very stimulating controversy. Lautrec showed there in 11 Cezanne watercolors, extremely abstract watercolors by Cezanne, which were very controversial but very exciting. In April of 1911, Picasso showed there were 38 watercolors and drawings, including many of his 1909, 1910 analytic Cubist works, and this is a scene from that, 38 of them. In fact, Stieglitz wrote about them in an article in Camera Works and tried to explain them to Americans. Stieglitz tried to sell the entire collection to the Metropolitan Museum. They were offered 38 works by Picasso, watercolors and drawings, for $2,000. And guess what they did? No, they said Americans would never accept this or take this artist seriously, and they passed on that one, but that would have been quite a collection. What I love about this picture is there's even an African sculpture hanging on the back wall of the place. They also showed Brancusi's. They were the first to exhibit children's art, first to exhibit African art in the US, in this tiny little place. They went on to, Stieglitz in Paris went on to form a group called the New Society of American Artists in Paris in 1908 to sort of go along with this. And a lot of Americans there were part of that group. So they were all sort of interconnected. Now, all of this is in taking us up to the Armory Show. What comes out of these years at 291 is a new desire, an incredible desire to be informed about European art. Americans wanted to know, and American artists wanted to know. So there was a need for that. And there was also a need to sort of break down what they called a stifling smugness of the condition of American art. There was this sort of very insular, very local, not open to new ideas of any kind. And they really wanted to break down that wall and just sort of open the door. And so they decided, let's have an exhibition. I mean, not our little galleries, let's do a big international exhibition. And this is going to lead, they only had like less than a year to put this together, lead to one of the most important exhibitions in this country ever. It was the International Exhibition of Modern Art, held in the Armory in New York, which that's why it is known as the Armory Show. It's all we ever call it, in 1913. Now, this comes about not out of the blue, but it's influenced by a series of exhibitions in Europe of international art, which is a new thing. Now, going back into the 19th century, remember those world fairs I talked about, and they would often have a large exhibition accompanying them. One of the exhibition halls would be of art from that country. They were rarely international, like your local works being shown. 1910 was one of the very first large-scale international exhibitions organized in London. It was known as the Post-Impressionist, we call it the first Post-Impressionist exhibition, and it was intended from the beginning to be international. It's not really what we call Post-Impressionist. In 1910, that word didn't mean what it does today. In 1910, Post-Impressionists meant everybody working after Impressionism. It was a broad term. We have a different hindsight, and now we see it differently. But at the time, it just means everything new after Impressionism. It was international, and a lot of people came. 1912 was the biggest year. That's when we get the second Post-Impressionist exhibition organized by Roger Fry, who's a very important British art critic, and his voice becomes very important through much of the 20th century. But even more than that is the Sonderbund exhibition in Cologne, in Germany. And the Sonderbund, one of these incredible exhibitions. The name is Sonderbund. It's very hard to translate, and there is no exact transliteration, but it roughly means we're all different and we're all together. We're all the same, yet we're all different. Or we've come together, but we're different. Something like that. You know, it implies that it's an international show and that we're all the same because we're all modernists and we're all interested in these ideas, but we all do different things. And that really was the model for how to do an international exhibition. Arthur B. Davies, the American, was kind of put in charge of organizing this thing. And the first thing he did was send a couple people to Europe to start organizing. Walt Kuhn was the main figure, and then he also worked with Walter Puck and somewhat Alfred Maurer in Paris. So let's think about what these guys have to do. They have to go to Paris and convince a bunch of people to send their art to America. Now, that may not seem like such a big deal, but it's 1912 when he's doing this. Europeans' sense of America is very different from what it is today. In Europe, they thought that the streets of New York still had cowboys and Indians in them. They thought of the Wild West. I mean, they had no sense whatsoever that it would be safe to send anything to America, let alone art. And nobody, very few people had done it. A few people took chances individually, with Stieglitz, but this is a big, big undertaking, a whole different thing. It was a major problem. So they have the idea of, listen, these exhibitions are together. The Sonderbund is already together. The Post-Impression is already together. It'll be much easier to go to one of these big international exhibitions, get the work from there while it's already away from home. It's already packed up, and just have them send like the whole big sections of their work to New York, rather than going out and meeting every artist individually and arranging individually for every artist to send their work. And it was very, very slow at first. Nobody would agree, nobody would do it. And slowly you get one person, and then you can go to the next person and say, well, he's sending his art, how about you? And then the next person has got like, well, these two guys are doing, so then it speeds up, and now, well, if they're doing it, then it's okay. And eventually they do manage to round up a lot of major works. About the only movement that was not represented, and I'm going back even to the Post-Impression, the real Post-Impressionists. There were Cézannes, there were, I don't think there were Monets, I don't remember, but there were several Post-Impressionists and symbolists, and then the rest were 20th century. The only artists who had no representation were the Futurists. And if you remember when we looked at those Italians, right, the Italian Futurists, they had their own exhibition in 1912 that traveled from Paris over to Germany. And remember, they sold out in Germany. They had no work to send. They had literally sold out in Germany and had nothing to send to New York. So New York didn't get to see the Futurists. But yes.
Peggy, then I'm understanding these are also places that you can buy these paintings. Is that correct?
I am not at all sure about that. I honestly don't know, but I don't think so. No, this is an exhibition. I mean, you couldn't, no, I don't think you could buy them. There were no dealers, representatives, or anything. These are purely exhibitions. Just like you go into the Nelson and see a contemporary show, you're not going to buy the art there. It's just to look at. But I'm sure they had available information on who to contact should anyone want to buy them. It usually works that way. Now they're putting this all together really, really quickly and trying to figure out how this is all going to work. They got the armory, and I'm trying to find the address of where the armory was, and I can't seem to find it.
Listen to that on 25th Street.
Oh, was it on the screen?
Yeah, and there's in red letters.
Oh, on the poster.
Yeah, the poster.
Oh, thank you. Guess I could read that. Yeah, 69th Infantry Regiment Armory, New York. Thank you. That's where it is. And the list, you can see there's a lot of 19th century names on there. Ang, Delacroix. I'm going back to the Romantics. So a lot of different people. The other thing that is rarely even mentioned, 3/4 of the works of art in the Armory show were actually American artists. It's not all European art, only a small percentage. And yet that's all anybody ever talks about are the Europeans, because that's really what sort of shocked everybody. There were, in fact, works coming in right up to the last minute, American works, which meant if you've ever been involved in any kind of exhibition, this still happens, and it's a nightmare. Like last week at the auction, we had things showing up literally the night of the auction. How are you supposed to make a catalog? And on something this size, it's a nightmare. So what they did was they rounded up every art student they could find in New York, and there were lots of them, as volunteers, and they were happy to do it. And they gave them little badges with the pine tree, which is the symbol of the Armory show. It goes back to the flag of the American Revolution, had the pine tree. So this is like an American image. And those students memorized the names and locations of every work in that show. So, and they had big sign, ask me, help or whatever. And you could go up to any of the volunteers and they could take you to and show you. That was quite an operation. But I feel for them, having done, somewhat similar things. I'm sure that was really exciting to them to get to be able to do that. They were just thrilled, I'm sure, to sit up and memorize all that art and then get to take people around. So the works were put on a ship. I don't remember where they sailed from, Europe, on one ship. All of this art, all of the greatest art of Europe is on one ship in 1912, sailing across the Atlantic to New York. And it was late. It was 2 weeks late, and they had lost touch with it. Can you imagine them sitting in New York going, oh my God, what have we done? This could have destroyed America. I mean, no one would have ever given us art again, if we lost on ship. But it showed up 2 weeks late, and they had to rent this other huge building to store it all. This is the actual armory when it opened in 1817, International Exhibition. There are a number of photos. People have attempted, there have been at least 2 attempts to reconstruct the armory show, or at least bits of it from photographs in later exhibitions. Let's try and find all the works that were in this room and put together a show. So there have been some later attempts. You can see one of Brancusi's, Madame Pogany here. So there are sculptures as well as paintings, all sorts of things. This looks like, I swear that's a Hodler. It looks like a 19th century symbolist work. It's hard to identify them, but they're...
It's a little like Seurat. I mean, it's
where?
A black and white, that one.
That one? I think that's Hodler.
Black and white version.
I know, but that's not a Seurat. I know that's not a Seurat. I'm pretty sure it's a Hodler, but I'm not, the proportions are wrong for Seurat as well, slightly, but I wouldn't swear that what it is. But I recognize some of these other sculptures and bits of things, but it's just filled with everything. So how did people respond to this? Well, in the end, there were like between 1,600 and 2,000 works of art, mostly Americans, but well, it was really slow. The first weekend, not that many people showed up. By the second weekend, that's when the storm broke and people started going crazy and it started hitting the press. And it became, this is when the cartoon came out. I mentioned this when we looked at Duchamp. That's the cartoon that was in the paper, The Rude Descending a Staircase, that they sort of focused on that one, a painting by Duchamp. He had no idea, of course, that this was happening, and it made him absolutely famous. Rush hour at the subway. Seeing New York with a cubist. I love the cartoon. I mean, it's really good. And it's not really cubism. It's not really futurism. It's just a young painter trying to create something influenced by other people. It's hardly one of his great paintings. But anyway, this is when the storm really broke. And, some people were outraged and others were, some people loved it. Some people loved it just because it was a breath of fresh air, just to have some new ideas in the air, even if you didn't like the art. There's an apocryphal story about Teddy Roosevelt, which isn't really true. Teddy Roosevelt did go. He went to the show 4 days after Wilson's inauguration. When Wilson was inaugurated, then Roosevelt, no longer president, felt he could go, but as president, he didn't want to go and have an opinion and whatever, but he went. And there's this apocryphal story that keeps being repeated, as they are. Even before the internet, there were stories that circulated that everybody repeated, and they were wrong, but said that he had a private showing and that he was so upset he kicked one of the paintings. It's totally not true. And he wasn't actually that upset. In fact, he wrote, you can find the thing he wrote an article in 1913 called the article was called A Layman's View of an Art Exhibition. It was published in March 29th, 1913 in an issue of magazine Outlook. And you can find the whole, it's not long, you can find it online. And he took a really moderate tone, actually. He didn't care for the paintings, and he didn't take them seriously, but he did laud the fact that they were being unconventional. He liked the spirit of the show. He called them European extremists. Americans have always had a bias against Europe in many ways because of our inferiority complex. But I've read the whole thing, and he's such a politician. It was so political. He didn't want to insult anybody. He wanted everybody to think he's on your side. So if you like the show, he said enough good things about, well, I'm really glad we did this. It's nice to bring this in and it'll shake things up. And then you don't read the part where he talks about, these extremists and how ridiculous it is and all of that. So if you didn't like the show, you focus on that part. If you like the show, you focus on that part. But he didn't kick them. It was just a very political, perfectly expected political point of view. But the fact that he didn't have to even go. I mean, I found it interesting, and it's interesting to read, because most Americans weren't like that. Most Americans aren't politicians. They're either, terrible, horrible reviews, or they're really, really positive, kind of like news today. So the Armory show then really, really introduces art and European modernism, 20th century European modernism. So all that's going on, you have a lot of Americans experimenting with European modernism in the 20s. None of them are really understanding it yet. I'm not going into these people because there's too many of them, and none of them are really have a clear, distinct point of view. They're experimenting with it. But what happens in 29 takes over the art world and begins to dominate everything. And of course, I'm talking about the Great Depression and the chaos that comes out of that. And I want to talk about some of the programs that come out of that. Many governmental art programs. The very first, the very earliest things that we're familiar with are not really programs, relief programs at all. They're not really part of the WPA. And that is, starts with the Resettlement Administration in 35, which is renamed in 37, the Farm Security Administration. The FSA was responsible for this is it largely in the South, in the Dust Bowl area, where you have poor farmers, people starving, sharecroppers, and they were charged with not giving money, because it's not a relief program, but offering loans to people and resettling them, moving them from areas where they couldn't really farm to other areas. They felt they were doing a good job, and they wanted to document the good work they were doing. And so they hired a group of photographers. And most of us are familiar with these images. They're some of the most iconic American photographs that we're ever going to have. They play a very important role because they really show the documentary power of photography. People had known that before. I mean, they're photography series associated with both the Civil War, the Crimean War, but this is sort of documenting a different kind of social context. And they largely failed in documenting the good work of the government. That's why the government in the end didn't publish them. They were published later independently, but not by the government, because they showed pretty bad conditions, not the really good conditions that they wanted to see. The two most famous photographers of that group are, of course, Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans, and I'll show you his in a moment. She is known, and this is one of her most famous images, the migrant mother, sometimes is called Migratory Pea Pickers Camp. Her focus is more on the people. You can recognize the difference between a Dorothea Lange and a Walker Evans. They focus slightly differently. Her work is very sort of internal, even psychological. She gets very, very close to the people to document them. These are beautiful and classic photographs. This is my favorite of her works. I think this is, as an image, is incredibly powerful and sophisticated. Here's proof that photography is not simply a mechanical act of pointing a camera at someone. Look at the composition and the design in this, the way she is taking this one figure who's in this sort of roughest looking hat and turning his back on the other. I mean, it's a story of isolation. This is also a good example of a kind of illustration. This is illustrational. She's illustrating a story. At the same time, it's fine art. It's a powerful image, a beautiful image, but you could see why it wouldn't satisfy someone who's trying to tell you things are getting better and everything is all right, because that's not the message. Walker Evans, while he does focus on people, focuses a lot on the environment. He's in many ways a more technical, in general, more technical, and they're beautiful photographs, but you're back at a distance. You don't connect to the people in the same way that he did. So he gets these wonderful street scenes, this one in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And he also follows the government line a little bit more. He's showing stores that are open or people at work. He's not showing the worst of the worst. Here, for example, the roadside stand in Alabama, this is, things are good, crops are growing, people are selling them. And his works were the ones that were eventually published in a book by James Agee, very famous. I used to have a copy of this, and I can't find my copy anymore. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. I think it's still in print. I think you can still find it from 1941. And it's all, I don't know if it's all, but it's many of Walker Evans' images. They're really fine images. But that program is often erroneously lumped in with the WPA programs that supported artists, and this is not. This was by the FSA, and it was a totally different thing. They were just hired to do this. They weren't like being supported. So let's talk about what does happen with the New Deal relief programs for artists. Many of them were associated with the Treasury Department. And let's take a look at some of them. Okay, one of the earliest is the Public Works of Art. Public Works of Art was a short-lived program that, as you can see, the dates are there. It was a sort of pilot program. It just gave out a crash program means just, here's some money real quick, go feed yourself. It didn't last but a few months, maybe 6 months at the most. And then that was replaced by the section. The section lasted for quite a while, the Treasury section. Now in this one, they contracted artists. In the Treasury section, they were contracted and they were contracted to create very specific works of art. They principally decorated federal buildings. They would be given a contract to, these were mostly mural painters, but there could be printmakers or sculptors, but mostly these were painters. They were anonymous competitions, so nobody knew who they were, and it was just given out on a case-by-case basis. You weren't like permanent employees. Word went out, we need a mural in this school. All of you, apply, and we'll give somebody a contract to do that. That was one way. As you can see, over 1,400 contracts. That was very helpful to people decorating the buildings. TRAP, the Treasury Relief Project, employed about 450 salaried artists. Now this was a little bit different, but this money was given directly from the WPA to the Treasury Department. So the WPA sponsored it, but they gave the money to the Treasury Department, and then they also created art for federal buildings, but the artists were not sort of piece by piece artists, they were salaried. So they were on salary. About 450 artists found jobs under that and worked under that program. But the most far-reaching program, of course, directly from the WPA was what was known as the Federal Arts Project #1. That was the program for visual artists. They actually had programs. Project #1, Federal Project #1, actually included theater, included music, included the visual arts, but the FAP, or the Federal Arts Project that we know of, that's the one that is for the visual arts. And it took over a private program that was run by an organization called the College Art Association. The WPA took over from them. Now, the College Art Association was and still is our national organization. I was a member of the College Art Association. It's the national organization for all artists and art historians who teach at colleges and universities. And I was surprised to find out that CAA was running a program like this, before the WPA came in and took it over. So they took it over. A lot of people get confused on the name. I was confused for a very long time what WPA stood for, because I kept seeing people using different words. But when it was formed, it was the Works Progress Administration. But in 1939, they changed the name to Works Projects Administration. So you will see both. So don't be confused. It really did. WPA stood for both of those things. Now, this is the big one. This is the one that supported more than 5,000 artists. Now, this is a particularly important. I want to say something about this federally sponsored work in general. This was a model and a catalyst for art in the United States. The artists who worked on the WPA met each other, formed groups, and really became the foundation for American art after the Depression. And artists later who did not work on the WPA said that throughout the rest of their life, they felt left out. They felt on the outside because they were not part of this tight core group of people who met each other and worked together in what were sometimes really difficult situations. I also want to say this was a huge opportunity for women. Women have never had it so good in America in the arts as during this period. It was the first and probably only time in their lives when they were paid equally with men. When large percentages of women were involved. Many of the women later who go on to be artists, one woman who talks about it a lot is Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock's wife, who we will talk about later, worked on the WPA. And these women have really, really fond memories of the camaraderie that all of them had in the WPA. So it was really important for a lot of women. And I want to sort of come back to that later as well. There were a number of divisions within the WPA. There was a mural painting division, and the mural division, again, creating for federal buildings, libraries, post offices, train stations, which is common government. There were over 2,250 murals that they made. There was an easel painting division, created over 100,000 paintings that were on sort of loan to schools. Schoolrooms were filled with art, and they would rotate the paintings to different schools. We need this now. This would be great. Not only schools, but libraries, any public building. You could have art all over your walls. Because the government owned everything they made. That was the deal. You were on salary, and they did a good salary. They got $95 a month. That was a lot of money during the Depression. And for that, you had to do a fixed number of works per month, depending on, what you worked in. If you were a printmaker, you had to make so many. If you were a mural painter, you had to do so many, sculptor, whatever. There was a sculpture division. There were 13,000 sculptors, but the biggest division by far was the graphics division, graphic arts. Today we call it the printmaking division, and they did prints, but they did lots of posters. They did almost 250,000 prints from like 13,000 originals. So they were a huge division. A lot of women were in the printmaking division. I have an image of printmakers. Posters really were their mainstay at the time. You will notice when I show you some of the images of both the people and the imagery, you're not going to see all those women. Women were everywhere working during the Depression, but you never showed women working. That was a negative because there weren't enough jobs for men. Women shouldn't be working. If there are unemployed men, women shouldn't have jobs. So you don't see the women working ever. And we'll talk about that later. So the printmaking division was 40% female, 40%. And 23% overall in all the divisions was female, huge community. They also, they said that really helped them form a group identity as well. Women participants, I mentioned Lee Krasner. She commented on this lack of gender discrimination for the first time in her life. And one reason she felt, and a lot of people agree, that there wasn't a lot of gender discrimination was that there are very few rules, in the imagery of what you made. One rule was they called no sexually explicit imagery. What they meant was no nudity. So no nudity. And she said, that was really good for the women because it took there's a whole history of the idea of the nude in art in relation to both male artists and female artists and how this creates an environment. It creates a different environment. And by removing that from the mix, you didn't have this sort of uncomfortable reference to this history that just wasn't there. It wasn't an issue anymore. What I mean by that, we know through Western art, study of the human figure, of the nude, was a major part of art education and art training. We talked about, if you were with us for 19th century, we talked about the academy, the importance of the nude. We talked about the Rome Prize and how you had to do these drawings of the nude. Well, women were never allowed in nude drawing classes, and that forever eliminated women from gaining the skills that were at the core of art education. This was an important part of why there weren't as many important women artists. In 1971, an art historian named Linda Nochlin wrote an article called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And it's still a groundbreaking article that everyone should read. When she wrote it, at the beginning, sort of the feminist movement in 1971, it caused an uproar. And everyone's first response, or women's first response, was, well, wait a minute, yes, there were. But no, there weren't. The fact is, there really weren't. There were a few. They were exceptions, and they generally made it because they had access to education that most women didn't have. Maybe their fathers were artists or their brothers were artists. That's usually how it went. So they had some in to training. But most women didn't get trained. They were excluded because they weren't taught the skills you need to be a successful artist. And being a successful artist is a lot more than just making art. It's also the skills of knowing how to market yourself, how to interact in the right circles. There's all sorts of things. Being a good artist and being a successful artist are not the same thing at all. There are many great artists who were never successful because they didn't have the skills. Look at Van Gogh. He's successful now because he doesn't have to go out and interact with anybody. He's dead. But when he was alive, he was never going to be able to go out and schmooze and do all the things you need to do to be successful. Well, women weren't trained in those things either. The exclusion from the nude, the studio wearing nude, even a male nude, female nude didn't matter. Women were excluded as artists. Why? Because it was felt that their presence would make the male students uncomfortable. It wasn't because they wanted to protect the women. It was because they wanted to protect the men who would have been uncomfortable had there been another woman in that room, because it would have changed the environment. It wouldn't have been that elevated. They could no longer pretend that this was some elevated thing and that it wasn't really sexual. Not when there's a woman standing next to you looking at the same nude person, male or female. It changes the environment. So that's why women were excluded. And women have always known that they're excluded, because they're as much as you pretend that that room is, outside of the real world, that it's some elevated art space, then you're not going to acknowledge the dynamic that's really going on there. And that's as true. That's true. I mean, I've been in many classes like that. And you do get in a zone and you forget about it. And after about, a month into the class, nude body, you don't even think about it. But it takes a while, and not everybody in that class is of the same mindset as everybody else. So removing that whole thing from the entire environment, they felt shifted and allowed them to sort of come together. Now, another thing that I want to talk about is the process itself, because the process lended itself to certain styles and types of art. And I'm going to, before we move on, it's just a few things that the printmaking division was responsible for. There were prints about everything, promoting everything. It's the Works Progress Administration. That's an early poster, confidence. What they all have in common, everything that comes out of the WPA, whether it's posters or paintings or sculpture, it's all about one thing. It's all about things are doing fine. We're fine. Things are getting better. Everything's looking up. It's always positive. It's always uplifting. The arts are flourishing. You have supports there for the arts. 1/3 of a nation, Oregon WPA Theater. It's everywhere. Always positive. Now, I want to talk about the style and why the art looks like it is. This is 2 examples from the mural painting division. And I want to talk also about, what we mean by social realism. First of all, the style. As I said, one rule, no nudes, that's it. In theory, you can do anything you want. In theory. In reality, it didn't work this way. The process itself was highly competitive. Any project, to get this project, you had to submit. You were on permanent payroll, but to get each job, you had to do preliminary drawings. They had to be approved by 2 or 3 different people. There were supervisors that needed to approve your work. And the process, because of that, was very, very competitive. If you strayed from the approved preliminary drawings you submitted, you could lose the job. You didn't stray from that. Of course, they're only going to approve something that meets their expectations, their positive expectations, something uplifting. They didn't say you had to work in a social realist style, but that's what got approved. And if you didn't do it, you could be laid off. And if you got laid off, it was very, very hard to get back on. It was a grueling process. So everything was there to encourage you to work a certain way. You can't call it censorship. It wasn't written down anywhere. It didn't say you have to do this, but it's the depression. You need to eat. You need your job. You need to do what they want. So it was a very subtle form of censorship that sort of pushed you into this one vein. The most pressing need was to show men at work, and I mean men at work, need to show crops growing in the field. needs to show buildings being built and roads being built. And patriotism was at the core of it. I mean, this is a perfect example with these two. The arrival of the first settlers, the patriotism of America, rooted in the Protestant ethic of hard work, and then the soul of progress. Progress was like the word of the 1930s. Progress is the essential word of modernism to a great extent. The faith in progress is what defined the modern era, and the failure of that faith is what defined its fall. The lack of it is what defines the postmodern world. Progress is by definition a positive thing. There is no such thing as negative progress. Progress means movement towards something better. And if not moving to something better, it isn't progress. It's just change. So progress is everywhere. In the same way that the word victory is everywhere in the 40s, during World War II, it's victory this and victory that and victory this. In the 30s, it's progress this and progress. Just look for the buzzwords of a decade, and they will open a door for you into the inside of what's driving that period. Now, is it realism? It's what we call social realism. It's realism with a strong social agenda. It's not a neutral eye at all. There's nothing neutral about it. It's very politicized, and it's seeing things in a very, very specific way. Okay, so pressures to conform. That is what we're talking about here, built into the system. I'm emphasizing this because we're soon going to look at totalitarian art in Germany and Russia, where we see exactly the same thing happening. However, it is now a legal requirement there. But the difference between what's happening in Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany and New Deal America is not that different. It's still coercion to work in a certain way on patriotic grounds. The difference is if you don't, the worst that's going to happen is you might lose your job. But that's pretty bad in the 1930s. To lose your job could mean your life. Okay, so farms, the dairy farm, this is to counteract what's happening in the Dust Bowl and relocation projects and everything that we have there. The Children's Bureau, I discovered the Children's Bureau still exists. I didn't even know there was still such a thing. But they are a bureau in the government that is focused on, children and their health and their security. And it's changed a bit from then. It focuses a lot more now on abuse, things like that. At the time, it was more to do with health. I think it's so interesting to look at government programs, ads, what people bought, what people sold, and what that tells you about life. I have a collection. It's just kind of off the point, but kind of not. I have a digital collection of old radio programs, like from the 40s and 50s, those old radio shows. And a lot of them are the original recordings, so they still have the original commercials in there. And so that's the most interesting part of them, are the commercials, because a lot of cigarette commercials. But you know what? There's also a lot of weight gain drugs, medications to help you gain weight. Yeah, right? Like, what? I'm not shocked by cigarettes, but gain weight? I mean, not in the world. Is there any product out there now, that you can buy pills to gain weight? And it made me really think about it, and I had to think about it. But right after the war, World War II, that was a big problem. A lot of people were going out needing to gain weight. They hadn't. So right away, that's not just about pills. That's about a moment in time and how people lived and what they struggled with. I think that was the most shocking thing I learned about that era. So, this is another similar thing. People aren't looking for weight loss during the Depression. They're trying to eat enough food to stay alive. The other thing you see a lot of emphasis on is rural electrification. This is one of the huge goals of the WPA. I lived for almost 30 years in Western Kentucky, just down the road from the original Kentucky Valley Authority dams that were the first to create electrical power. I mean, where I lived, we were swimming in electricity. Everything was electric. That town I lived in, I don't think there was any natural gas. It was all electric, everything. Because we were like 10 miles from this massive electrical source, but everybody there is very well aware of their role in electrification. But that was a sign at the time. That was a symbol of progress. If you could say this rural area is now electrified, you want that out. You want it in photos, you want it in paintings. That was like a message. So here, Rural Electrification Administration Co-op Office, that's a big message being communicated here. Another one, now a painting, a mural. These were also not only electrification, but their technology and industry at work, and the most advanced technological tools and materials. So it speaks of progress. We take electricity for granted. Who thinks about electricity? Of course, unless it goes out or something, but. And believe it or not, baseball was one of the biggest themes in the art of the WPA. If you saw, what is it, a league of their own, the women baseball players, right? That really brings it to the forefront how important psychologically baseball was. This was the national sport. Forget football, forget basketball, forget hockey. There was baseball, and that was it. And it was everything to everybody. It spoke of normalcy. It spoke of, life goes on. Everything's okay as long as there's baseball. And so you see all these images of baseball players that everyone wanted to see. It just made you feel good. So yes, baseball is everywhere, in the dugout. These were the major themes. It's never what you expect. I certainly wouldn't have guessed. I might have guessed electricity or something if somebody mentioned, but I would have never thought baseball was that big a deal. But these are the images. This is the language they're speaking during the Depression, that they wanted everyone in the government needed people to see this. So what's happening in these totalitarian countries? I'm going to start with Nazi Germany, and I want to talk about Enttartete Kunst. Adolf Hitler thought he could paint. And he did paint, and he wasn't horrible. But mostly, he despised modernism. Now, when we talk about German art, we're primarily talking about those German expressionists, Kirchner, Beckmann, all these, distorted figures showing their angst, and the German Dadaists showing their disdain for the Weimar Republic and the corruption of government, and all of that is what Hitler comes out of. Actually, that's why he happened, because of all that. So Germany was in a mess. But the problem with with abstraction in general is it's not very good for propaganda. It's a really good language to complain about things, but it's not a really good language to exalt ideas, if that makes sense. It's not good for propaganda. What did they use in America for propaganda? They used realism. If you're speaking to the masses, you have to speak in a language the masses are going to understand. You think the masses are going to understand, non-objective art? Of course not. You can't. That's not a language that but you need to speak to the lowest common denominator, the broadest public, and they're going to understand realism. That's it. Plus, in realism, you can speak about things. You can, it's good for propaganda. Modern art isn't. It's that simple. And he wants to be the man of the people. He wants to speak in the people's language, and we don't need all this stupid intellectual Jewish art, which is basically how he framed modernism. In Nazi Germany, modern art was framed as Jewish. Now, that's interesting because not that many artists were Jewish. However, a large percentage of museum directors and gallery owners were Jewish. So use that to link abstraction and progressive modern art to Judaism and degeneration, which leads us to Entartete Kunst, which is in many ways the greatest and the worst art exhibition ever held. It's one of a kind. There's never been anything like it before. No one has ever put together an exhibition of art just to mock it, just to make fun of it, just to write slogans over it and talk about how horrible it is. No one's ever done that before or since. And it really was the greatest exhibition of modern art in Europe at the time. And many people knew that. I mean, just because Hitler says it's horrible doesn't mean some people didn't recognize it was actually quite great. Entartete Kunst, using the term, entartete or degenerate implies quite literally genetically inferior. I mean, this is what it means. And he is linking the art itself to the propaganda that's out there relating to those who are persecuted. It included 650 important paintings, sculptures, prints. It also included books, and I think there was even some music playing, jazz, degenerate jazz. Here are some images and slogans. They've also reconstructed this. It was in 1991. They only did it once. It was in Los Angeles, and it was a reconstruction of Entartete Kunst, and they put out a huge catalog and tried again to bring together as many of the works and reproduce, because we have lots of images of it. So these are basically the works we've been looking at through much of this class. It's not just German art. He went in and basically raided all of the German museums and took all of the work from them, put them here. Afterwards, many of them were destroyed. They had a big burning thing, but a lot of them were sold under the table. This is how he financed much of what was going on. He knew these were good works and that people wanted them. So they've sold them all off and filled the treasury with an awful lot of this stuff. My German isn't good enough to translate all of this. I think at one point I knew what it said, but I know it says something like, they take this seriously and things like that, little mocking statements. They would take, Cubist works and hang them at an angle, to mock the angles of everything. People would like laugh at them, etc. But in one day alone, 36,000 people went to the show. Everybody saw this show. In fact, it brought in like the official sort of academic German show had just been held, and this show later in the year had like 5 times more people saw this than the actual official show of German art. It's really disturbing propaganda imagery. Here are some of the posters. You can see referencing Africans, linking them with Jews, African sculpture, making them look Jewish, just taking all of these, non-Aryan imagery. The worst, I think one of the worst things that they did, and this was being done in magazines and newspapers, where they would take pictures of people who were in asylums or hospitals and juxtapose them to images of modern works of art as what they call proof of degeneracy, that these images like this are responsible for really the genetic degeneration of the human race. And this was sort of all surrounding this exhibition. So it's, totally politicizing of aesthetics in every way that you could imagine. People lost jobs. This is when non-Aryans were losing jobs, particularly artists fled. The Germans were the first to flee before other Europeans fled. So a lot of Germans went west. into France, then west into England, then west to America quite early. We talked about some of the horrible, like Kirchner fled to Switzerland and ended up committing suicide. Beckmann came to America. They also mocked Russians, you know, in addition to the sort of primitive, which is what they saw, Jews and Africans and others, but they also attacked Bolshevists, and that was the East. That was the other worst, the other bad thing. And I love this poster. This is a Nazi German poster. It did a beautiful job of recreating that Russian style. This is still an Entartete Kunst exhibition of cultural documents of Bolshevism and Judaism. Arbeit. Shoot, I know what that means, but I can't remember. And I can't remember what that says down below either. But, you know, look at that style. Here is an actual Lissitzky. I mean, they're mimicking the colors, the clean lines, the shapes. It's a beautiful version of that sort of Bolshevik style. So, you know, as the essence of modern, Hitler says modern art is communist. Stalin says modern art is fascist. So what they both say is modern art isn't any good for propaganda, darn it. So I'm banning you. Now, what did they like? If they didn't like modern art, what was encouraged? What were you supposed to work on? Well, social realism again, just like in America, showing family, showing all things well in a realist style that the common people can understand. I mean, that was part of it. Man, you see this in our Congress all the time. Whenever some congressman gets all upset about something going on in art, they will attack it, and they will attack it on the grounds that, well, I'm just one of you and we don't like this stuff. You know, we're just ordinary people. Those sort of elitist intellectuals, that's how it's seen. It's always the same language. It's always the same attack. And it's a way for them to, you know, curry favor with the masses, particularly in Germany, large families. They wanted families. They were always encouraged to have more children, you know, good Aryan families. There are also references in here to traditions in 19th century German art that I don't want to go into, but they would have seen this more in connection with, you know, good old-fashioned traditional German art. That's sort of the language that you see here, glorifying families. Others, in other ways, things like this, there are a lot of images of old men and youth. The old men are the sort of, you know, the underpinning of the nation. And at one point, I knew what those newspapers were, but they're propaganda. They're reading something, some Nazi propaganda, and they're smiling and they're happy, and they're dressed in their older traditional ways. So again, they're speaking of tradition. And of course, the Hitler Youth, that's a scary picture. I just find that image of that little boy, I'm sure it was supposed to look innocent and sweet. It looks scary as hell to me. It's just a really frightening image, but that's what.
Interesting is how blonde that little boy is, and the previous families that you were showing.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Look at all the blondes.
Little blondes.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. This is the cream of the crop, right? This is the top. These are the best of the best. This is what you aspire. You aspire to. Definitely. Oh God, the sculpture they liked is absolutely appalling. I mean, it's just, I don't understand how they could not see how bad some of this is. Readiness, the one on the left, it's such a bizarre, it's like they're trying to, the one on the left anyway, they seem both to be trying to tap into the link between heroism and the nude, right? The heroic nude going back to, you know, the ancient Greeks, but it just doesn't work, especially the one on the right. It absolutely doesn't work. The point of heroism being nude and universal is that you have nothing, no clothes, nothing that links you to a moment in time. So you become timeless, you become universal. But when you put on a Nazi helmet, you know, you don't look nude, you look naked.
What is the weapon in the general?
I think it's just a sword.
Is that okay? It's a sword.
I think it's just another sword. But the one on the right is the one that looks really bizarre because of it's totally because of the helmet. If he wasn't wearing, because that helmet grounds him in a moment in time, and it makes you wonder why he's not wearing clothes. And that's the difference between naked and nude. You don't need to ask why a nude figure isn't wearing clothes, because it's not reality. It's something else. It's a universal metaphor. When you put some clothes on somebody, it's not a universal metaphor. It's a person, an actual person at a moment in time, and it just looks ridiculous. Anyway, what's Stalin doing? Oh, same thing. What can I say? Self-aggrandizement. Only now we call it socialist realism. What's the difference between socialist realism and social realism? Nothing. Other than one's a communist, so we call him, one's a socialist, so we call him a but it's the same thing. It's sort of realism with a political agenda. It seems that this term began to be used in the early 30s, about 32. They started calling it in Russia socialist realism. It became an ideology that was enforced and became official in 1934 when Stalin formed the All-Union Congress of Soviet Writers first, and then Soviet Artists. It was based on the idea that all art should glorify the political state. That was their goal, and socialist ideals of communism. You had to, he said all artists had to join the union controlled by the state, but nobody came and did anything to you if you didn't. However, you had to be a member of the union in order to shop in certain stores and buy certain supplies. It was structured so that if you really wanted to make art, you better join, because you're not going to be able to operate if you weren't a member of this union. So, and then if you were, you had to work in a social realist style. Socialist realist style, that was it. Here we go. Look what the Lissitzky in 1920 is doing this. Remember, I'd said at the time, for a brief moment, Russia was at the forefront of modernism in the West. And then it all comes crashing down. In 1920, that's Russian art. In 1927, that's Russian art. Lenin is dead. That's what did it. Lenin was the big supporter of modernism. Sports games, that's big in German art too. We didn't see any examples, but being healthy, being sporty, hiking in the woods, these are good, healthful things for families to do. Same in Russia. More propaganda like this, construction workers writing a letter to Stalin. This relates to the sort of agitprop trains that they were sending out. Again, I highly recommend if you want to see the movie Reds, where you see all this happening, and they even have like the trains going out with all this propaganda painted all over them. And that's what this is. So these poor guys out there dying, they're going to stop and write this letter to Stalin and thank him, I guess, for whatever the heck you want to thank Stalin for. Yeah, I'm sure that this is happening. This, roses for Stalin. Stalin goes on a lot longer, so you see more feeding into his style. This is our version of the Hitler Youth. It's the same sort of thing. Now, this one, to the great Stalin glory. I mean, so obvious. Here he's actually tapping into traditions of large paintings of people like Napoleon. To me, this is very Napoleonic. I can just see Napoleon and his massive groups of people. So this is the 30s. Couldn't be more different from the 20s, could it? So let's now go back and see about independent artists in America. 30s, but not working with the WPA. Independent artists. It's called American scene painting, and it is still a kind of social realism. But they're all different types and different artists. I want to look at three: Edward Hopper, Thomas Hart Benton, and Grant Wood. These are three of the most important of the American scene painters of this intermediate period. Edward Hopper is fascinating. I love Edward Hopper. He's one of my favorite artists. I just adore him. I could look at his works forever. He's on the cusp. He's someone who is he's an American, so his work is very American, his subjects are very American, but he's also working at a period where he's very aware of abstraction and the way, a different kind of formal language, and he brings them all together. So he's absorbing, working when he does, he's absorbing everything that's happening. He studied the New York School of Illustration, and again, illustration comes in. That's the way he made his career. He studied with William Merritt Chase, if you remember. Remember, if you were in the 19th century class, William Merritt Chase ran this school out in on Long Island, where students would come out. He was a part of that group. He studied in Europe early in the century, 1906, and then 1909 and 10. He did exhibit at the Armory Show, but he seems, I'm going to say seems, to have been little affected by what he saw there. But I think he was affected, but not in an obvious way. He didn't go out and start working that way, but I think he absorbed some of the sensibility, and you see it in many of his works. Something like this, for example, Early Sunday Morning. He's a painter of the city, and he particularly is drawn to scenes that don't necessarily glorify America. His spaces are what's intriguing, the spaces he creates and the people in them. They're sort of quiet spaces. They're sometimes empty spaces. They're very poignant spaces. He's like saying things without saying things. And unlike the WPA artists, they were glorifying everything. He's not really doing that. In something like this, I see someone who has absorbed some elements of European modernism. The way he's using these, verticals, horizontals, the geometric shapes. This is still structured on a grid, not unlike the way Mondrian does it. It's still about balancing forms. It's parallel to the picture plane. I think there's a constructive element in here that does show an awareness of modernism, but it's subtle, it's absorbed. He's not painting like Mondrian, abstract forms. He's painting a scene, but I can't say that, I wouldn't say he wasn't influenced by European art at all. I think he was. Really beautiful painting, the lighting, the drama of it, and a place for people without people. That's always poignant when you have like no one there, but they should be there. And the light tells us why, so does the title. The Room in Brooklyn. This is something common as well. The idea of the loner and the outsider, heightened by the fact that there is a window. And we've encountered windows before. Again, last fall, we saw 19th century painters who used windows as a way of looking through a space, suggesting two realms, like an interior and an exterior, and two worlds. Windows can be very symbolic. We saw Delaunay doing a series of sort of post-cubist works where he used window, sort of abstract window forms, windows onto the city. In this case, there's a sense of isolation, the way she sits near this window looking out. It seems to also juxtapose things like not only interior and exterior, but sort of quiet and loud. You've got this modern building. I mean, it doesn't look that modern to us, right? But this is 1932. That's some sort of office building, or maybe even a factory building. There's something about that space which is more modern, and then the more traditional interior. And yet the light is diffused. There's so many things to look at, but look at the verticals, the horizontals, the way it's structured around these repeated geometric forms and shapes that shape each of the little spaces. There's a geometry there that's very modern, as well as the flat colors, the flat color fields. Of course, his most famous piece, Nighthawks, which is in the Chicago Art Institute, which is a very well-known piece. I know there's always in his works a suggested narrative. This one in particular, I think there's a really strong suggested narrative here. This is just me. I love suggested narratives. Of course, then I study surrealism, so I don't like people telling me everything. I like things that are mysterious. So I'd rather have a suggested narrative than a narrative. It's more interesting. Don't tell me the story. Just give me a hint and let me think about it a while. So why is she sitting there? Is she waiting for someone? Is she watching the street? There's a story here. I don't know what it is. I like that I don't know what it is. I can make up my own story. The same is true with this. It's more questions than it is answers. It's mysterious. I always wonder how much he is influenced by surrealism, because I can also see surrealist influence. It's very, very much like several of the surrealist works we looked at last time, where there's kind of an odd space and an empty room and a mystery and what's going on. There's definitely some of that in his works. Who are these people? Again, we're outside, we're an outsider, we're looking in through a window, the suggestion of two different spaces. You feel like, well, if you open that door, it's a whole different realm. Maybe there's music playing, maybe the temperature is different, but it's an isolated space and we're not party to it. We're just looking in. This is where I always ask, what time do you think this is? What time of day do you feel this might be? There's no right or wrong. I'm always curious as to what people think.
Night, I think.
Yeah, but when? What time? 1 a.m.?
Early morning, yeah.
1 or 2?
Right after deadline.
Right. And when is deadline?
Well, press start is midnight.
Oh,
And then you can go out and get your coffee and go home.
okay. Seems later to me, like 2 or 3 even, because there's nobody. I mean, I would think even at midnight or 1, there'd still be people on the street, you know, coming home from something. But whatever it is, it's a really isolated time.
I'm thinking of the same building, the red brick with the same.
Yeah. That building.
Yeah, that same building.
Right. He likes that building. We're seeing it again. And then people have questions about, well, of course, who are these people and what are they doing there? I mean, but also nobody's communicating. Are the man and woman together? Or are they just sitting next to each other? They're not speaking to one another. They've been somewhere. She looks a bit dressed up. I mean, men, you can't tell. They always wear suits, you know, you can't tell. But that doesn't look like an ordinary day dress. She seems a bit dressed up. But whatever it is, it's a mood that he's creating. And I find it kind of surreal. It gets even more surreal. I think this is one of his most surreal works from 51, Rooms by the Sea. What a strange point of view, what a strange angle, what strange lighting. The way the water, this is surreal. This is what a surrealist would do. Where do you have a house that you step into the water? Is it one of those houses on stilts? I mean, maybe in Miami, you know, you bring your boat. This is very, very surreal. And I think it's accentuated by his lighting, his extreme exaggerations, where you just get this little sliver of an image back here. But I love, again, it's about shape and flat color planes. If you blocked off that left half, that left corner, and squinted, that would be pure abstraction. Just shapes, just like geometric abstract shapes. And then with the little waves, take it into the surreal. Sunday morning, 52, this building again, out the window. Where is she? Nothing else in this bare room. Is it a
Looks
hotel?
like the same building over there almost.
It does, that one out the window. I love the building she's in because this is tile work. This identifies it as a very modern building in 52, this exterior tile work. So it's a really unique and interesting building. But again, it's about these shapes, these giant flat color plane shapes. There's a lot more, Hopper. You can look up a lot more on him anytime. Let's look at a regionalist. Someone I'm sure you all know, Thomas Hart Benton. And I'm sure you've all seen enough of his works. From Neosho, Missouri, student at the Chicago Art Institute. in Paris for 3 years, but didn't seem to be influenced that much by it. He is what's called a regionalist, and there are a number of regionalists. Grant Wood is another, as we'll see in a minute. Scenes of the American South and Midwest. Developed a very unique and recognizable style. You can't really miss his styles. He is tapping into this revival in the 20s and 30s of mural painting. There's a real revived interest in murals, large scale murals in the 20s and 30s, especially in the 30s. His style is one in which he depicts little vignettes, small little segments, in an exaggerated, what I would call a mannered style of these elongated, curvilinear, sort of fluid-like forms. I think they're influenced by surrealism, but he would never acknowledge that, I'm quite sure. We call it mannered because it's very much like mannerism. And again, if you had the Western course, when we looked at Renaissance, the art that followed the Renaissance was called mannerism, and it had these really exaggerated, elongated forms. It's really beautiful Italian mannerism. And this is very like that. It's called a mannered style, where it's very individual and idiosyncratically exaggerated. That's sort of what mannered means. He taught, of course, at the Kansas City Art Institute in the 30s and early 40s. And he's best known for some like big series. And I'm sure you've all seen, if you've been to Jefferson City or, you know, the various places, you can see his murals, including the Nelson. One of his biggest series, the America Today series, 3031. That series you can recognize, there's just a few of them, 10 paintings. He uses these sort of architectural elements to separate some of the vignettes. And they're very similar subjects to WPA art. It's people working in factories and building things and the like, in a fairly realistic style. Even though it's not WPA art, it's what people wanted. You know, sometimes when styles develop, it carries over, even though he didn't have to work that way. It was the style in America of the 30s. Here's one called Steel, subjects that he often did. But the series that is best known is the Life in America series, which he did 2 years later. And there were total of 8, 4 major paintings. And I want to look at those 4. Arts of the City. Now, these are little vignettes, but he doesn't use the little architectural elements to separate them. They're just kind of in their own little areas. These, when he says arts of the city, he's looking at it's arts of the city and arts of the country and arts of the South and Indian art are the 4. And by art, he doesn't like mean painting. He means things that you do well. You know, this is your thing in the city. And so he kind of shows in some way, some people see it as sort of the corruption of the city, but it's definitely city life that you see, you know, the gangsters and the music halls, and I'm not sure what the heck's going on up here, just drinking. The Arts of the West is sort of one of the best known pieces, where you get, of course, the rodeo and the guns and the country music and the dancing. And again, these odd, you know, don't you see that as being very surreal? You know, so the odd angles and the stretched figures and the, I do, it's very much surreal. You know, next time we're going to be talking about the New York School and Jackson Pollock, and Pollock studied with Benton. And even though he denies there is any influence whatsoever, you do see in Pollock, you do see some of these things, the way these sort of curves and counter curves and the way things swerve into one another, just like Benton's doing right here. You see in early Pollock's Arts of the South. Now, Benton does a lot of work that is anti-Semitic. He does a lot of anti-Semitic work. He does a lot of racist work. It's really extreme in a lot of his images. And he was very vocal about it. And I've always had a problem with Thomas Hart Benton because of that.
I heard of
a critic talk at the Nelson. He gave a lecture
Yeah.
about Thomas Hart Benton, and he said he was originalist with pretty much no talent, and this guy was Jewish, and he said that, and he said what you said, that he was anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Oh, he was. It's true.
If you read his autobiography, I would highly recommend it.
I haven't read that.
It just bowls you over. You're like, oh my gosh.
I know.
But it's really a good read. I think you wanted to see
And
how far you can go with it.
he did some Cubism stuff too.
Yeah, well,
Very
very early, he did some European style right about that time, but then he dropped that all pretty quick. But I don't think a lot of that, it didn't all leave his work. I'm always troubled by that. How do you handle an artist when, you know, on a personal level, you find them repulsive, but I'm supposed to be semi-neutral about it, but I'm also a human being. I can't be neutral about it. I don't agree that he is talentless. I mean, I'm not going to buy that. You know, he is influential, and he is, as much as I don't want to say it, but at the same time, he was these other things too. He was a human being. So I'm not going to, I don't like to elevate too many people in my life, you know, because very few people in this world deserve great elevation. And Indian arts, I'm not quite sure what the heck he's trying to say here. Here, see these interesting ways using these shapes. I love this negative space, the way he's working, if I can get my cursor to work. This space right here, this kind of negative space, I love the way he's using that as a kind of, it almost becomes a positive space as it sort of curves around the figure. I find that really interesting, and it's very similar to what Pollock is doing. I'm going to bring this back when we look at Pollock. Okay, Grant Wood. I love Grant Wood. Grant Wood was a one-trick pony. He had one successful painting in his entire life, which is unfair because I kind of like some of his others as well. There was an article about him in 1934 in Time magazine, and they placed him in opposition to what they call the incomprehensible European artists of the time period. But the fact is, he really hadn't done that much. He's just this local guy who grew up on this like farm in rural Iowa, and then moved to the big city of Cedar Rapids. He did travel. He did go to Europe, but didn't really seem to embrace anything. His early works influenced by the Impressionists, but you don't see it all that much. Of course, his most famous piece is this. He painted this for a competition at the Chicago Art Institute, which is where this is located. And he was just driving around and he saw this house and he wanted to do the painting of this house, but he felt that he needed to add, you know, some character to it. And so he sort of decided on the theme, and then he chose like his sister to be the model for the woman and his dentist to be the model for the man, because he just, you know, liked the way he looked. His intention is that this is meant to be a father and a spinster daughter. They're not a couple. It's a father and daughter, and it's named after the building in the back, American Gothic. That architectural style is called Carpenter Gothic. It's the name of that because it has this pointed arch Gothic window. It really is incredible. It's a far more sophisticated image than most people recognize. He's using a lot of really interesting repetitions of forms to draw your eye in, like the three prongs of the pitchfork is echoed in the sort of shape, the three prongs here of his bib, which echoes the sort of three sections of the window. There's a lot of repeated forms like that in the image itself. He did win the bronze medal in this competition, and then they bought it after that. Critics saw this as a satire. They saw it as a satire, clearly, but that was not his intent at all. He did not mean this. this was done, you know, during the Depression. He saw it as a symbol of sort of steadfast Americans on the homestead, etc. It's sort of American patriotism. That's how he saw the piece. He absolutely didn't see this as satirical. He's not that kind of person. A lot of people think of this as, especially in the contemporary art world, where we have sort of neo-Dada and there's just lots of sophisticated satire and stuff going on. It's easy to go back and reread a lot of works in more of a postmodern light, but that's not really right for this piece. You know, he's influenced by things like tintype photography, which is certainly a big part of it, that sort of stiffness, that lack of expression. That's what he's looking at and referencing in a work like this. Also, when he traveled in Europe, one of the things that he saw that that forever had an important influence on him was 15th century Northern Renaissance paintings. And I'm talking about Flemish 15th century art, particularly people like Jan van Eyck, and the rest. And this is a Van Eyck portrait, and it has many of those same qualities. It's a very slick surface. There's no brushwork visible. It's a very sort of linear painting technique. In other words, where you're working with small lines that merge rather than large marks of paint, which is called a painterly technique. It's a different technique where the figure is sort of looking at you in a very sort of severe manner. And he loved Van Eyck portraits, and you see that in a lot of his work. This is the house itself. I love that the house, you've seen this? It's in Iowa somewhere. It's near Cedar Rapids, near Stone City, Iowa, right?
I can't remember. But
yeah, he was in Stone. He set up during the Depression. He set up an artist colony in Stone City, artist colony in Iowa. It's a beautiful little house. I love that. I love that style. This is what most of his paintings look like. His regional style. I know it looks kind of surreal, but it's actually rooted more in traditional American, what's called limnist style, this primitive 18th century American painting style. Let me show you some. That's Grant Wood on the left, but the two on the right are painted in what's called an American primitive style, dates from the 18th century. This is really a kind of untutored style of art. It's true primitivism. It's like, you know, Grandma Moses primitivism. These people know nothing about art, the history of art, or anything else. They're just working like a primitive. There's a childlike simplicity and quality to it, and his work has more of that in it than anything else. There's something sort of really pure about it. It's totally untempered by anything else. Here's another one, Fall Plowing. I love these pieces, but they never get shown. Everybody just goes to American Gothic, and that's all they really know about his work. But I love something about the simplicity of them. You know who else they remind me of? Darn, I should have brought his works in. Henri Rousseau. Remember at the beginning of the 20th century, the guy who was a primitive, part of Picasso's circle, but he did these strange jungles and the like, and he reminds me of that. He was very much a primitive, you know, really in the middle of the art world, but mentally he had nothing to do with it. You know, he was completely in his own world. And there was something so pure about what he did, so childlike. And I think that's what, you know, the Picasso circle were drawn to. And there's something in these works by Grant Wood that remind me of that purity. Now this appraisal, I mean, I see, again, 15th century Flemish art. I see Northern Renaissance in this. This is pure Northern Renaissance style, but it just happens to be American costuming, but it's a 15th century Renaissance style. And I think that's fascinating. I love that chicken. Look at the detail, the refined detail. And that woman could pass for. And then this one, who do you see in this? I'm anxious to see if you see any influences. What? Yes, I see Benton in here. And I don't know if I brought, yeah, I see some Benton in here. And it's in that, the elongation of the figure, the unusual point of view, the way your eye is drawn back in these sort of angles and curves to the back. Yeah, I absolutely see some Benton in this. And he certainly knew, you know, Benson's work without a doubt. But yeah, I'd like Grant Wood to get more attention. Maybe he will in the future, who knows? Well, that takes us through kind of conservative bent of the 30s right up to World War II. So what we're going to do next time is talk about what happens in the art world during World War II when all these Europeans come over to New York and what that does to New York and how it creates this foundation of the so-called New York School, the first real original modern artists in New York. And the center of the art world stays in New York. When the war is over and they go home, the center of the art world stays in New York until, I would say, probably the 80s and 90s, when the rest of the world really steps up and we get an international art world. There's no such thing as Western art, no such thing as Eastern art, no such thing as centers. Everywhere is making contemporary art, but we're not going to get into that. So does anybody have questions, comments on anything we have talked about today?
I thought it was interesting in the Grant Wood of the American Gothic. Everything's fairly rendered except for her little apron. And her apron doesn't have, I mean, his overalls, you can see the wrinkles. You can see the folds.
And hers is
Her apron is like
a flat pat, right? It's flat pattern. He does seem to be trying to suggest some sort of curving here, but not curving back or around the body. Yeah, it's just flat. Well, it reminds me of 15th century painting. They were often like that. They didn't have a lot of subtle value.
But it's not the same. I mean, it's
Where's-
more like his other things. Those other things are very flat and patterned.
So you're saying these are the exception.
And the roof and the, the
Yeah.
shadowing and the building.
Yeah,
But the
I agree.
trees are flat again.
right. It's a very mixed bag. I mean, look at those trees. They're just perfect little, like a bubble. It's like a green bubble more than it's a tree. And yet when you look at his lower face, there are inconsistencies. And maybe that's why he's not on anybody's list as the greatest artist. I'm sure that is one reason, because he is mixing a lot of styles here. Personally, that doesn't bother me. But I'm quite sure it would bother many people. But you're absolutely right. He does do that. Anything else, anybody? Well then, what? Oh, you're very welcome. We'll see you all next week when we jump to New York and look at our abstract expressionists and start to see the Americanization of modernism. It's different. We're going to see how they absorb European modernism, but Americanize it. It's very different. And I'll just give you one hint, is they make it much more physical. It becomes a physical thing, more physical than intellectual. So think about that. And then we'll see next time how they do that.
Thank you, Peggy.
You're very welcome.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.